Physics, MSc, and NGS. He wore various hats at Bell Labs and Bellcore before becoming a professor at the University of Maryland. He's also the inventor of pulsed laser deposition process, and as a result, he published a lot of papers, more than 800 papers, 35 patents, and is globally among the top 100 physicists. He has an incredible citation record of more than 47,000, almost 48,000 citations, and H index of 110. Incredible academician, as you can see, but at the same time, an entrepreneur who is simply an inspiring figure. He is also the founder and chairman of Neocera. Neocera is a different company from Neocera Magma. Neocera, a company which is specialized in PLD systems. Close to 14 of his researchers, PhD students and postdocs under him, have become entrepreneurs, starting 25 different commercial enterprises. He's a fellow of the American Physical Society, winner of the Belcourt Award of Excellence, guest professor at Tsinghua University, winner of the George Paik Prize awarded by APS, President's Gold Medal of the Institute of Physics Singapore, etc., etc. He has a lot of laurels, of course. Because we are already delayed for the evening, I'm not going to read everything about him. He's a distinguished alumnus of the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur and Kharagpur. He was also awarded the 2020 APS Distinguished Lecturership on the applications of physics. So now it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you, Venki, for this evening lecture.
Thank you, Professor Pratap and Professor Khare for inviting me for this exciting evening lecture. So let me share my view graphs and are you able to see it?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So let me introduce the team. As you all know, actually, I'm mostly known for my work in oxides, but I had this amazing graduate student, Sritosh Goswami, and he introduced me to this molecular system, which was actually synthesized by his father, Sribrata Goswami, who is at IACS. And this started an adventure lasting, I would say, now 6 years. And I'd probably say in my 42 years of research experience, this is probably one of the most exciting experimental work that I've been involved in. And we also have collaboration with Professor Stan Williams at TAMU and Damian Thompson at University of Limerick. So let me start with rationale for low switching energy memory. Why do we care? Here, right up at the top, I put down, we have about 8 billion human beings on the earth. And I assume that every human being is thinking actively at the same time. So an average brain power of about 20 watts. And so we ask the human beings in all, we are consuming roughly about 1.6 10 to the 11 watts is what is consumed by humanity. Of course, there are two assumptions here. One, I'm assuming that all the human beings are active at the same time. And number two, I have neglected our existing US president out of this because his brain would completely throw off these numbers. So then next is, let me compare this with, let's say, power consumed by data centers in 2016. Roughly 3,000 times power is consumed by the data centers. Now, if I go to the year 2025, the anticipated global power consumption is going to be 20% of the power generated on the earth, basically. And by 2045, we won't have adequate power to power all the data centers, literally. And the good news is 50% of the power consumed in the data centers is actually by the memory. So if we can come up with low energy consuming memories, we literally will have a global impact. So that's what motivated my work, and I was excited to discover an organic approach. In fact, I'm going to tell you about an organic approach, an oxide approach, and also live biological approach. So the three things I'll cover today. I'll probably spend up more of my time on the organic system because it's truly very original and exciting. This is our organic system. So the molecule that you see here is essentially a ruthenium at the center of the molecule. It's surrounded by three identical ligands, and these are essentially phenyl azopyridine ligand. And you see each ligand has got an azo group, N double bond N group. Okay, that is really the hero in this entire story that I'm going to be talking about. There's also an ion called a counter ion, which it could be either a pair or it could be an individual ion, and they occupy a space very close to the molecule, and the two of them together, the counter ion system plus the molecular system, comprise a single entity, and all the behaviors are controlled by the relative spacing of the counter ion with respect to the entire molecule. We can spin this molecule on, and what we do is we take an atomically flat indium tin oxide substrate, and basically this is indium tin oxide is grown by PLD process onto a YSD substrate. It's not only single crystal, but it's absolutely flat and very conducting. And we spin on this organic compound, which is the brown layer on top of it, to a thickness between 20 to 80 nanometers. And then we evaporate the gold dots, and we measure the transport right across the gold to the indium oxide across the molecules. And this is what you see. You see this very beautiful switching characteristic. This is the current density is plotted as a function of the applied voltage. And what you see is the device goes from point 1 to point 2, switches to position 3. There's a hysteresis, it comes back down. And then when I go to the negative side, it switches immediately back to and goes to position 4, then comes back down to position 5 and back. Now, what is this fuzzy looking thing this brown cloudy thing? That is actually overlap of essentially data from 321 devices. These are devices ranging in size from 1 micron to 100 micron, a large number of them, and you lay all the data onto this, and this is the overlap of all these data. And for an organic system, this is truly remarkable because we have never seen this kind of a reproducibility in any material system which is organic in nature. So this is one of the first major surprises for us. Okay. Now, I'm going to describe two families of molecules, and the one on the left is the one I'm just talking about, which is the ruthenium phenyl azopyridine. And there is another one, ruthenium TD2, which is a different molecular system, which has got essentially 4 azo groups in it. You know, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and there are 4 azo groups in this molecular system, and that exhibits some very, very interesting properties. So let me first come back to the original molecular system, and let's go through what all it can do with this. Now, one of the interesting things about this molecular system is we can do Raman scattering, and we know exactly the redox state of the molecule. This is very unique in organic electronics because in organic electronics, you look at, there are roughly thousands of papers published, and there are very, very few devices in which people understand the physics of what's going on or the chemistry of what is going on because there isn't a clear diagnostic technique. But in this particular family of molecules, the Raman scattering is really, really valuable. Okay, here are 3 different redox states the molecule is in, and this is the Raman spectrum. And what you see here is there's a lot of molecular band that you see here which don't change at all when I change the redox state. However, there are 3 modes, marked mode 0, mode 1, mode 2. They dramatically change in intensity when the redox states are changed. The state 0 corresponds to essentially the azo group in its neutral state. Whereas in state 1, it's essentially 1 electron reduced, and state 2 is where it's 2 electron reduced. So now by looking at the Raman spectrum, you know exactly what is the redox state of the molecule. So now I can go to this actual electronic spectrum that I see here, and I ask at each position, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, what is the redox state? At position 1, what do I see? I see there's a single 1 unit at mode 0. At mode 1, I got 2 units, and there's 0 at mode number 2. So what that tells me is the molecule is in 0, 1, 1 state. There are, twice 2 ones and 1 0. When I come to point 2, essentially it becomes 1 0 0. As you can see, the 0 mode is now doubled in size. And when I come to the switch point position 3, all the mode is now under 0, and therefore the molecule is the redox is now 0 0 0. And now, if I similarly, when I come to position 4, you see that it's in 1 1 1, and finally switches down to 1 1 2, and then finally comes back to 1 1 0. Okay. One of the interesting things that you notice is so-called off state, that is, the conductivity is low. That off state, the redox states are dissimilar. That is, at least one ligand is in the wrong state. Whereas in the on state, you notice something interesting, that all the redox are in identical states, like 0 0 0. And if you go to point 4, which is also a high conductivity state, everything is in 1 1 1. Okay, so there is a rational reason for this, and the reason is it has to do with electron hopping between molecules. Okay, so when in this device, essentially when a voltage is applied, electron from one of the electrodes hops through the molecules and then reaches the other electrode on the other side. Okay, and the molecular hopping very much depends upon the redox state of the molecules. For example, if they're in 0 0 0, the LUMO bands, or the so-called, in condensed matter, we'll call it the conduction band, so the LUMO bands of the molecules all line up because they're identical states. So it's very easy for the electron to hop from molecule to molecule. But now, when I come to, let's say, when one of the ligand is dissimilar, then the hopping probability from, let's say, this molecule to a similar 1 0 0 molecule will be roughly 2/3 that of, let's say, the 0 0 case. But then it has to, going from bottom metal to the top metal would require 40 hops. So 2/3 to the power of 40 becomes a very small number. And that's why you get a very large on-off ratio of about 1,000 in this device structure. So that's the reason for that. But we also get a hysteresis, and where is that coming from? The hysteresis has to do with the counter ion. Remember I told you there's a companion ion that sits around. So these are like PF6 molecules in this case, and this counter ion sits in very well-defined spatial coordinates right next to the molecule. So when I change the redox state of the molecule, the counter ion will move to a slightly different spatial pocket, and that pocket gives it inertia. So when I turn the voltage down, because of the inertia of the molecular system, I get a hysteresis here. Okay, so for example, if I now change the counter ion, make it from a light counter ion like chlorine, essentially boron and 4-phenyl group attached to it, which is a very heavy counter ion, you can clearly see the hysteresis become very sluggish. So this tells you something to do with the inertia of the counter ion. So these are the tools with which you can actually control the property of this molecule. We can also do effect of field enhancement and what it does for it. So for example, we make 3 different types of devices. In device A, the bottom electrode is large area, then the top electrode is also a large area. So there are 2 flat electrodes, okay, the molecules in between. What do you see? This is the current density, barely gets to about 10 to the 2 amp per centimeter squared, and the switch on voltage is around 4 volts or so. Now, let's go to device B, where on the indium tin oxide, we deposit a bunch of gold nanodots. So what that gold nanodots do is they locally enhance the field. So in device B, what happens is, you see, suddenly the switching voltage dropped from 4 volts to 0.4 volts, drops by 1 order of magnitude. The current going through the device jumps up by 2 orders of magnitude. Now, I go to even further field enhancement, where I replace the top electrode with a conducting AFM tip. Now you see the device now is roughly 60 nanometers squared in area. And for this device, the switching voltage drops down to 110 millivolts, which is really drops down to 110 millivolts. And the current density goes to megamp per centimeter squared. So the field enhancement really helps this device. And in fact, when you make the device smaller and smaller, it gets better. Here, for example, are patterned bottom electrodes, and there's molecule everywhere. And when we apply a conducting AFM tip and scan over it, you see by 150 millivolts, this 100 nanometer dot is fully switched completely, whereas the region in between is not switched at all, And what this tells us is that when we make these devices into nanostructures, and right now we've shown that we can get down into a size smaller than 7 nanometers, and we'll be able to operate these devices with ultra low voltages, which is very, very exciting. The reproducibility of the device is very, very remarkable. The error rate if I create a chip with, let's say, a million devices in it, the fact that one of them is in the wrong state is in like an error rate, you can sort of say, is like 1 in 10 to the 13, which is really remarkable for an organic system. The other things are you can essentially cycle the device and turn them. You can write, read it, then erase it, and then read it again, and then write again, read. So you kind of repeat this voltage cycles and, many number of times. And look at the current, how it switches, okay? And what you see is the switching current is very, very consistent. These are the different levels that we're probing with it. The rise time here is about 30 nanoseconds, and that is because this is a twisted wire measurement, not even a quartz measurement. And therefore, with a more sophisticated measurement, we have found this to be less than 5 nanoseconds. We believe the ultimate switching speed is probably about at least 0.5 nanosecond or lower. Now, these are the different switch states. These are, after every switching, these are the recorded switch states. And you can see they're absolutely rock steady. We have gone to 10 to the 12th cycle, and still all the states are absolutely preserved, showing the robustness of this memory. In comparison, if you had your thumb drive and you switched it this many times, by 10 to the 6th cycles, you start getting errors in the flash memories. And this is about 1 million times better than a flash memory, which is remarkable. If you now put these states in a high temperature of 80 degrees centigrade, and you leave glass in an on state or off state, then they are rock steady over a period of 3 months, basically. This is from here to here, 3-month period, and there's no change at all in the device characteristic. I really was very curious to figure out how does it compare with, let's say, an ITRS roadmap. So I contacted my friends at Intel, and they said, Venki, well, after 2015, we don't make ITRS roadmaps anymore, but I've got the data for 2015 for memristors, so I got it there, and we started comparing with the property of what is expected for ITRS roadmap. They want read current to be greater than 10 nanoamp. We can achieve microampere. The best next organic device is about 200 femtoamperes in comparison. Right erase time needs to be on the order of a nanosecond, where right now we have measured less than 5 nanoseconds, but it's still limited by our measurement technique. We think it's probably something closer to 0.5 nanosecond or better. And in the right cycles, they want it to be greater than 10 to the 10. We have achieved greater than 10 to the 12. And right voltage should be less than 0.6 volts. We get about, basically 150 millivolts. And read voltage should be less than 0.2 volts, and we're about 50 millivolts. And it should be less than 1 picojoule switching energy or writing energy. And here we are, in this particular device is 450 attijoules. But I'll show you a better device here. This is the device which switching on is about 17 millivolts with an on-off ratio of 1000. And the conductor AFM tip, the switching energy that we see is 1 attajoule. My knowledge, I don't know of any room temperature device, a switch with an on-off ratio of 1000 with this kind of a switching energy of 1 attajoule. I mean, this beats the nearest competition by almost 3 orders of magnitude. So indeed, this is I feel is going to truly revolutionize memory technology. There's a lot of things we can do. We can change the electrodes on the top and bottom electrode, and that changes these characteristics of the device. So there's a lot of tunability that we can achieve by just playing with, metallization, electric field enhancement, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of editing that we can do. What is also remarkable is when we combine these comparative oxide mentors, the interesting thing is that these are the switching is absolutely homogeneous. There is no filament formation. We are conducting images of the current profiles in the on state and the off state, and there's absolutely no, homogeneity that one sees in this stuff. These are actually pattern electrodes, and another devices that are in pattern. They're down to about 7 nanometers, and the molecular size is 1.5 nanometers. We believe that is the ultimate limiting size for devices we can make with this system. And these are Raman spectrum, but obtained with tunneling enhanced Raman spectra, so that we can actually look at the Raman spectrum at a molecular level, basically. How is behavior at a molecular level? The answer is, if you compare the Raman spectra on the switching with the micro Raman in the large area device, they're identical. So there's no difference at all in the mechanism right down to the molecular level. The device is behaving exactly as one would expect. So this is in the sense very, very different from the oxide-based chemistry, where the primary mechanism is from oxygen vacancy diffusion, and they end up forming essentially filaments, and the filaments introduce significant amount of plasticity in the circuit design, and they have to essentially compensate for it. And we just don't have that problem with this particular electronic devices. Okay, this is a very remarkable we see, and we essentially work in a certain range of these devices. It sees multiple history fields. And what is really happening? This is a 16 nanometer film, and if you look at it, there are basically 3 separate hysteresis loops here. If I take 16 divided by 3, I get a number which is approximately 5 nanometer plus minus something. Okay, let's take 43 nanometer thick film. I get 8 hysteretic steps. Now, okay, 43 divided by 8, again, is 5 plus minus. Now, 64 nanometer film, I get 12 steps. And if I 64 by 12, again, it is 5 plus some small change. So what is going on? What's going on is essentially the molecular diameter is 1.5 nanometers, and essentially 3 sets of molecules are switching at the same time. Imagine this is a molecular system which I expected to be on office, right? You expect it to be an office system because I just spun it on. For some reason, molecules are self-assembling, and so as a result, what happens is you are switching 3 unit cells, and then the next 3 unit cells, and then the next 3 unit cells. So similarly, here, essentially 3, 3, 3, you're switching 3 layers of unit cells, which to me is amazingly remarkable. And the reason we are able to do this is because our Indian bottom electrode is atomically flat, I mean, literally atomically flat. Like if we introduce it, say, half a unit cell of roughness, this effect goes away, basically. So you can't see this effect. So this really need atomically flat substrate. But now, why is it 3 units of switching? And the 3 units of switching because this PS6, which is a counter ion that's sitting next to the molecule, is a relatively big molecule. So when the ion switches from one hysteresis curve to the other, the PS6 molecule changes position in space and forces the layer on above and below to switch. So you end up having 3 units of switching rather than 1 unit of switching. What happens to a smaller compound, like chlorine, for example? Can we then switch only 1 layer? And the answer is yes. For example, a 12 nanometer film shows 8, indicating that actually we're switching only 1 layer at a time, basically. A 41 nanometer film shows 29 steps. This is exactly what we expect for a 1.5 nanometer diameter for the molecule. So this is an amazing phenomenon that where molecule, after you spin it on a surface and you apply some voltage, it ends up self-assembling in device structures. And we're investigating this further because we need a further proof with some kind of X-ray diffraction technique. But the films are so thin, it is really very difficult to get signal to noise in most experiments to show that these are really oriented molecules. Okay, I now go on to neuron-like devices and why there is so much interest in neuron physics and neuromorphism these days. And one of the reasons is because the big locomotive that in our society is the AI, basically. It's AI sort of like James Watt's steam engine that kind of set off the industrial revolution. It is something equivalent to that. And we're going to see the effect of AML for the next, 20, 30, next, 2 or 3 decades. And so the conventional CMOS electronics, which is von Neumann bottleneck limited, is really not the best way to do human-like artificial intelligence kind of thing. So the cost of doing, trying to do AI using conventional CMOS is very energy inefficient. People are trying to come up with various ways to make them simulate the neuron. But for example, asynchronous logic is one example where the neurons don't have any synchronicity. And those are all things that are being put into things like biochips. And companies like Intel is working on things called Lowy series, and IBM is working on the True North series. So like that, there are different companies working on their own series of what I call neuromorphic chips. But they're still based on, essentially your CMOS transistor. And the human brain, to do what a human brain does, which is 20 watt, right? I mean, for example, the Blue Gene with the computer from IBM that beat a chess grandmaster was he couldn't crow about his achievement because the grandmaster was using 20 watts of power, whereas the supercomputer was using 10 watts of power. Okay, so it really, the comparison really. Simulating the human, one of the biggest challenges. Why? Because the neuron is an amazing technology. I mean, will human beings be able to really replicate all the functions of a neuron? Probably not in the next century. I mean, my prediction is it'll probably take a century to truly replicate the neuron and all its functions. Because many things are so counterintuitive and also so difficult to accomplish that no one technology can do all the things that a neuron does. For example, essentially they do not generate binary pulses, they're spikes. They're asynchronous, there's no time, there are no three-terminal devices. Every neuron gets 10 to the 4 inputs from all its neighboring neurons. Right? How to create 10 to the 4 inputs in a circuit? I mean, in a conventional circuit, maximum 6 interconnects, right? 2 of them probably will go to power. You got like really 4 interconnects to play with. So essentially, this is a huge challenge. I mean, people go into photonics to do, larger highlight broadcasting and connecting in the ways. But then photonics has its disadvantage in terms of trying to emulate neuromorphic. So there's no process that we know of today that can do all the things that a neuron does. The axon, which is the one that so you have the central processing unit of the neuron, and then you have the axon, and the axon essentially carries the information and communicates with neighboring neurons through dendrites. So the signal of a dendrite is dynamically processed. It's not a simple wire, and there's chaos in signal processing. Synchronicity in the brain, for example, is dangerous. That leads to human diseases, basically. There's a certain amount of chaos in the brain is very, very integral and necessary for sanity. The synapse, the most important component, is the starting point that everyone is trying to see synapse electronically. Okay, the first guy who really built the models for these is they watched and these two guys basically took a giant squid. And essentially, the giant squid is a very, very large neuron, of the order of a millimeter in diameter. So they could actually, electrically modulate it. And essentially, they put 2 variable resistors and load resistor. This interesting model has been the so-called neuronal model for, since 1935 or 40s when they first came up with these models. And surprisingly, it's one of those few things that withstood the test of time. But that is mostly because electrical engineering community was really not interested in this work at all. So there's very little overlap in the neuroengineering, what I call the neurobio and the neuroengineering people. Very little overlap. Recently, essentially, Schwab introduced the same Huxley model, but instead of the resistors, the variable resistors which are supposed to represent the potassium and sodium channels, he replaced them with resistors. Okay? And Stanley in the Hewlett Packard actually demonstrated that if I can have a certain amount of essentially differential gain in the system, I can actually replicate the behavior of a neuron. This is essentially a scalable neurostor built with 3 more transistors, and is essentially now shown that you can actually simulate the neuronal behavior and pulsation using such a circuit. Okay. So this is kind of like what our precursors that we were faced with when we started our work. So what we started doing is, can we replicate such a system with the organic system? So we went to a different organic molecule, which is I mentioned earlier, and this is the ruthenium sensor, but it's got 2 ligands. One ligand has got 2 azo groups in it, and these 2 ligands are orthogonal to each other. These 2 are. Now, this particular molecular system, and when we build a similar memoristic device, shows this extremely interesting characteristic. It shows 3 memory states, 1, 2, and 3. And you can see in this state, the molecules, on the 2 sides of the molecules in identical states of charge, 0, 0, 1, 1. But the bottom state is in a completely mixed state, which is called 3, 1. I mean, there are 3 charges on one side and only 1 charge on the other side. And this has to do with a phenomenon called charge disproportionation. I'm going to come to that point in a minute. This device also exhibits the same field enhancement. So you can see that, as you go to higher and higher field enhancement, the switching voltage can be dropped down to 200 millivolts and 100, something like 150 millivolts here for the lower spin state, the lower excited state. Now, the bottom electrode, the bottom state, energy state, is essentially arising from this, during the Raman spectrum, we essentially arrive at what is called a mixed state, which is essentially a charge disproportionate state. Instead of forming 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, this forms what is called a 3, 1, 3, 1 state, where the molecules, there's essentially 4 molecules sitting next to each other. You can start to see one has got 3 charges, the next one has got 1 charge, 3 charge, 1 charge, and forming very, very large dipole in the system, basically, creating a huge molecular polarization. What does that do? What it does essentially creates, if I look at now the permittivity of the system, the permittivity also shows memory behavior. So in other words, if I look at the charge or effectively the capacitance that you're looking at, you've got a capacity memory here, basically. So this is not only a memoristor, but it's also mem capacitance. And this makes it very, very interesting because this introduces the capability to essentially create neuromorphic functions. So for example, by biasing this device in an appropriate way and adjusting the load line, essentially you have a resistor here. So the value of the resistor essentially tells you where you are in the load line. And this device actually starts, self-pulsating. It just starts exactly the kind of pulses that a neuron will put out, basically, a self-pulsating neuron. And now if I change the load line to a different resistive value, I get a completely different pulsation. And this pulsation is exactly the pulsation seen in a heart cell. It's called a cardiac myocyte. If I take my heart cell and measure its electrical characteristic, it'll look exactly like this. So this is essentially replicating a cardiac myocyte, really, And the other thing, that interesting things that our neurons do, they do something called integrate and fire. So this is essentially how a neuron is getting information from many different sources. And when it reaches a certain threshold of information, it'll fire a pulse. It's called integrate and fire. This is kind of like how decision gets made in a neuron. And this is what it is happening. So you can exactly simulate that. Here's the input pulses, which are all periodic. But what it's really doing is integrating it. And then this is the output. Every 135 nanosecond, it just fires one signal, because it's integrated this stuff. Similar thing here. So you can adjust this time by varying this resistor, the external resistor, by varying that the RC time constant changes that can change the firing period here. So this is really a very, very interesting neuronal function. And there's something called potentiation, which is also another neuronal function where under constant simulation, the system is very quiet, but once it suddenly reaches a certain threshold, it begins to become active. And this is a phenomenon called potentiation. So these are really very, very exciting things that are happening. But even more than that, you get this not only self-oscillations, but by adjusting the load line, you can actually get into a regime where this beautiful periodic oscillation degenerate into essentially chaotic noise. And these are also interesting characteristic of the brain, because in a brain, for example, when people become epileptic, the whole bunch of neurons in the brain become coherent and they're working together, and that causes epilepsy. And so the coherent behavior of the neurons is actually undesirable, and therefore a certain amount of noise is inherent to neuron electronics, basically. Okay, so these are the things that we can simulate with this type of single device. We can also create a whole bunch of gate structures, and so this is the kind of circuit that we use with a few devices, and we've been able to demonstrate. Let me just quickly get there. Yeah, so these are NAND gates, NOR gates, and or OR gates, and we can also demonstrate a 6 memristor base adder. Now, if I try to take a bunch of transistors and try to demonstrate an adder, it'll take me about 35 steps, whereas using these devices in 2 steps, I can essentially do an adding operation, which is really very, very remarkable, actually. So there are a lot of let me sort of quickly get out of these, and let me now move on to, so this organic system is truly remarkable. We've just submitted a paper in Nature, which is in the review, where we've actually shown that this neuronal memory can essentially do, in terms of what I call decision, in a single device, making if or else type of decision, it can do something like 71 different decisions, one single device. Whereas, for example, a CMOS device can only do 2. It can either do a 0 or a 1. But the device that we've developed now can do 71 decisions in a single device. So I feel that this is truly going to revolutionize artificial intelligence and the kind of electronics that we can actually make to meet the challenge of AI. Okay, now I move on to a completely different topic, and our oxide approach to build, low energy memories. And we use what is called ferroic tunnel junctions. Okay, this field is actually, has actually gone in prominence over the last several years. A number of people are trying a variety of effects like electrostatic effect, interface effect, and strain effect to create what are called tunneling electrode resistant devices. I'm mainly focused on electrostatic effect involving a ferroelectric layer in between. Okay, so these are basically what you will see if you build this essentially a tunnel resistant. The barium titanate is the ferroelectric. You have a bottom metal, barium titanate, and a top metal. And such a structure, vertical structure, will give you resistance versus, voltage characteristics, shows very beautiful hysteresis. This field got kind of crazy, like a GMR, and essentially people started putting many, many layers in between. And every time you introduce a layer, the on-off ratio would skyrocket. So now people get on-off ratios of like 10 to the 5, 10 to the 6. So it's been somewhat crazy, and nobody understood what is really going on. So we started studying this very systematically. So here we take niobium-doped strontium titanate substrate, which is a conducting substrate. We epitaxially grow a barium titanate layer on top of it. Now, imagine all of these are atomically controlled processes. That means every layer is essentially counted in terms of unit cells. Okay, so this barium titanate is like, n number of unit cells, and we know exactly what that is. And then on top of the barium, we put the platinum electrode. So this is the simplest tunnel junction you can make. Now, in between the barium titanate and the top electrode, I can now introduce different oxide layers. We introduced LSMO, where lanthanum strontium composition is varied, so you can create different LSMO layers. So you can create many interfaces, and you can see the entire structure is a coherent, single crystalline structure that you created here. And this is typical FTJ performance. You see resistance versus voltage. What you see is this is essentially the device is switching at a certain point. There's a saturation voltage, hysteresis, switching down and back again. All right. Now, how does it behave in the three classes of devices that we made? Very simple platinum, BTO, the NSTO, which is the conducting bottom electrode, or platinum with one extra oxide introduced between the BTO and the platinum. And here we have introduced two oxide layers. What we see is that exactly as I increase the number of layers, the on-off ratio does indeed get bigger and bigger. But what about the switching voltage, the saturation voltage? Absolutely no change at all. The switching voltage and the saturation voltage is identical for all the three different types of device structures. So it is only controlled by the ferroelectric. The ferroelectric determines when it switches and when it reaches saturation purely. Now, if you look at the actual resistance in the on and the off state, what you see is that when I change the number of buffer layers at the bottom, right? When you change the buffer layers, what you see is that the so-called on-state resistance, which is really the lower resistivity state, doesn't change dramatically, but the off-state resistance changes dramatically, and that is the reason why the on-off ratio increases. Okay. The truth of the matter is, our first commercial, GMR devices, magnetic tunnel junction devices that went into computers had only a delta R over of R less than 1%, okay? And it still became a commercial technology. So you don't need delta R over R of 10 to the 5, basically. You don't need to create a on-off ratio of 10 to the 5. A smaller on-off ratio is good enough. What you really need is the on-state resistance to be low, so that you can build, fast switching devices. And that is our challenge in oxides, because we need a low resistivity substrate, which we don't have. Okay. But what is interesting is we've studied, for example, number of unit cells of ferroelectric, and what happens to the RA product. And what we find is that the tunnel junction persists all the way down to 2 unit cell in this case of barium titanate. And in fact, here is an example of a 1 unit cell, in this case, bismuth ferrite. We've also demonstrated with barium titanate, 1 unit cell ferroelectric layer, and here is an on-off ratio, which is very finite, telling you that a 1 unit cell ferroelectric behaves like a ferroelectric. Prior to these data, there was a belief among theorists that it takes a minimum of 3 unit cells of ferroelectric to be a ferroelectric. But it turns out that one is just good enough, okay? Now we can actually combine this with oxygen vacancy motion. So if I take like something like STO and barium titanate, and I can compare them, I make memristors with STO. You can make an memristor using the oxygen vacancy motion in STO and create a memristor too, but they both have completely different behaviors. And in fact, if I can combine them in BTO, I can produce this type of characteristic, where this on-off ratio is coming from ferroelectric tunnel junction, and this on-off ratio is coming from actually oxygen vacancy induced the filament formation, and that gives you this kind of state. So you can create multi-state memories, like as is shown here, by using the combination of both the oxygen vacancy motion and the ferroelectric tunneling. Okay, so now I go on to a third area where we've been doing research, and that is can we grow neuronal cells in a controllable fashion on surfaces? Okay, so this is because what I would really like to do is to build a live neuronal circuit. I mean, in other words, purposely create an M by N matrix of neurons. That's what I would like to do. But to be able to do that, we need to be able to grow the neuron exactly where you want on a given surface. And that's a huge challenge, okay? So what we do is we study cell growth on combinatorial surfaces. So what we do is we take a PLD, essentially a process in which we can create essentially a surface where there are thousands of different compositions on a surface like that, and we can study cell growth on such a surface, and we study, how does the surface chemistry affect cell growth? And what we found is some exciting thing. We found that, for example, here is yttrium oxide on the left side and zirconium oxide on the right-hand side. This is a binary phase diagram. And I'm growing a variety of cells. This is a human neuronal stem cell. This is a fibroblast cell. And these are keratinocyte. These are three different types of human cells that are there. And they all show a very strong dependence on the composition of the surface, you can see. So for example, in the zirconia-rich surface, the stem cells, the neuronal stem cells grow very beautifully, but when it becomes yttrium-rich, nothing grows on that surface, okay? Similarly, in the fibroblast case, about 50% point, nothing grows on the yttrium and zirconia combination. But the moment the yttrium composition falls below 50%, the growth really starts rapidly. So this gives us a clue as to how we can localize neurons at a specific spot on a given surface, because what we will do is we'll take a surface on which it's covered with yttrium oxide, and only where we want to grow the cell, we put the zirconium oxide, and this hopefully the neural cell will go only where the encouraging area is there, right? And why is this important? Because, for example, there's a company called Neurosyntec in Silicon Valley. They are actually trying to grow neuronal circuits and trying to use them as sensors for a variety of applications, for essentially explosive sensing, for molecular sensing, and all kinds of stuff, right? And they like if you look at the neurons growing on the surface of the circuit, so there are electrodes at the bottom of the circuit, like something like this, which make contact with the neurons. But look at the neurons; they're growing randomly all over the place. It's a complete mess. They can't control it, right? So we're trying to collaborate with them to enable them to grow the neuron in very specific parts, so that the electrodes will then sample the neuron above it, and therefore be able to communicate with the neuron, and therefore we can make functional circuits using these ideas. So these are some things, this is work in progress, and these are some of the work we are doing right now. So I think I'd like to primarily thank Sritosh for getting involved with this organic system. It's been an exciting ride. And this molecular system was really the thesis project of Professor Goswami when he was a PhD student in Kolkata. And he is a synthetic chemist par excellence and is just an extraordinary scientist to work with. Of course, Professor Stan Williams used to be one of the pioneers in oxide and memristors, and he really promoted that field in a big way. And right now he's a professor at Texas A&M, and Damian Thompson did a lot of the molecular simulation to understand the mechanism of our system. So with that, I'd like to say thanks to all of you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
That was a fascinating lecture. Thank you so much, Professor Venkatesan. Amazing material system and unbelievable results. Anyway, so the floor is now open for questions from the audience. If anybody has any questions, please.
Chat box. The question. Actually, the question should appear in the chat box, so that I'm.
I don't see anything in the chat box.
They have to transmit. Because
Professor Rudra Pratap, I am Ashok Kapoor. I have a question.
Please go ahead.
The question is that it's an excellent lecture and wonderful work you have done, Professor Venki. The only thing I wanted to ask is, when you are doing that AFM experiment, the current density across the sample is so high, why there is no damage to the sample?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question. I mean, one of the fascinating thing about the molecular system is we have put these devices inside a vacuum chamber, and we heated the devices to 600 centigrade. Okay, and then we cool it down. We bring it back to room atmospheric pressure and atmospheric temperature, and we measure the device characteristic. Exactly overlaps the same characteristic before we did the heating. I mean,
yeah, but normal perception is that these molecular materials are very delicate, because when we work with organic electronics, and the whole element burns below the tip. So I was really surprised to see that nothing happens to the sample and you have absolutely reproducible results.
This is the thing that fascinated me about the system, because the ruthenium at the center, it's a four-coordinated system of these ligands, somehow gives this molecular bonding gives it a tremendous physical strength for some reason. It's able to withstand a temperature of 600 centigrade in a vacuum system. Okay, not in atmosphere, in a vacuum system. It's chemically reactive if I start putting in like a photoresist developer and things like that, they react with it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, in a physical sense, they're very robust. So that is the reason why we're able to switch them to like 10 to the 12 cycles, and they still don't die. And we're putting them in the on state and off state at 80 degrees centigrade. We operate them between 80 degrees centigrade and minus 45 degrees centigrade, and there's absolutely no change in the performance of these devices. I've never seen an organic system like this in my life. I mean, it's just, there's something miraculous about this. I mean, I've been telling Sri Vrata Goswami, he's the one who really fully understands why they behave the way they do. But I've always been telling him, we got to give a reason as to why this molecular system is so rugged. It's pretty remarkable, I must say.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sure.
Just to follow up on that, so if you remove it from the vacuum, or even if you do a little lower vacuum, what happens to the stability? Does it degrade rapidly, or what happens to the stability?
Moisture is not very good for it. Okay. And so what happens in a vacuum system, there is moisture in a vacuum system, right? And at the medium pressure, you will have water vapor and things like that. Right. I mean, generally, if I didn't heat it, right, then it was okay. For example, we have a lot of these devices sitting around in a lab environment, and they last for months and months and months, no problem. Okay. But if you heat it and then there's moisture, then it will react. Then it will deteriorate very rapidly in a moist environment. One of the challenges that we are facing right now is we are trying to make things like circuits out of it, and we're trying to pattern it, trying to do lift off and things like that. And there we are having some real difficulty because all the photoresist developers and things like that, they seem to react to the molecule readily. So we are now trying to figure out how do we pattern these using wet processes, and that is a challenge that we are working on right now.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Professor Venki, I saw an interesting question from the participant. I mean, the last slide that you showed on which neuron is growing on your material, in which different electrodes are there. So, what is the role of the neurons there?
I'm not able to. There's so much noise. I'm not able to hear what you're saying.
Okay, the question is related with your last slide, in which you showed that the neuron is on a substrate, and there are different electrodes.
This one? Yeah. So this is right.
Yeah, this is the one. So what's the role of the neurons here? It's like a conducting wire.
Okay, so essentially what happens is the substrate actually has got a bunch of electrodes at the bottom, so they can be biased. You can essentially extract signals, you can stimulate signals, all of these things, and they all end up in vertical electrodes sitting at the surface here. So what happens is when they lay the neurons on top of them, some of these electrodes penetrate the neuron or get through punch through the membrane of the neuron, and they can electrically, you can communicate with the neuron, send a signal to the neuron, or you can extract a signal out of the neuron. So that is the whole idea behind this stuff. Now, there is a lot of tricks involved here. In other words, they don't really punch a hole in the membrane of the neuron. What really happens is the neuron is a living thing. So what they do is they put something called aptamers, which are like some kind of an organic sort of molecular system. They just put these on top of these metal electrodes. They coat them with these aptamers. So what happens is when the cell lies on top of it, it immediately wants to eat up the aptamer. So it just gobbles the aptamer with the metal electrode into it. And when it does that, it makes the best ohmic contact to the neuron. And so these are all new areas, right? I mean, in other words, how do you make electrical connection to a neuron to measure them? This is a very, very painful process right now. Essentially, microelectrodes, and then under the microscope, they put it into a neuron, and it's painstaking process, actually. So there's a lot of interest now in trying to figure out ways by which we can make ohmic contacts to live neurons so that we can communicate with them, both sending information and receiving information.
Maybe if you are interested, I'll come to some of my colleagues. We have a neuroelectronics lab where this kind of electrical connection is established, and a lot of communication with neurons is already done. I'll connect you to some of my colleagues.
Sure, that'll be great. That'll be great. Yeah, sure. We'd love to. We would like to. This is a exciting, growing area, and our ability to manipulate neurons is getting better. So we need to really start thinking about what all we can do with this stuff.
Certainly.
I mean, for example, right? Our hope is to make, let's say, 7x7 neuronal matrix, and the way you can make the axon communicate with the next neuron is lithographically create a channel. Then the neuron will pick up the channel, and the axon will go along the automatically, and it'll end up on the next neuron, and you can actually artificially create a matrix like this. Now, if I have such a matrix, then I can electrically characterize that matrix. I can put a given input to the 7x7 matrix and look at its output. And then I can define a figure of merit that tells me how good are these neurons. So, for example, neurons taken from Einstein's brain versus, say, my brain. I mean, what are the huge differences, right? I mean, how can you measure that? That'd be interesting. Or, for example, a person who's got like some kind of a brain disease, how do their neurons behave in a circuit like that? What is their figure of merit, right? So we can actually start quantitatively trying to measure neuronal behavior, and by actually looking at their electrical characteristics and how they communicate with their individual neighbors, okay? So this will all give some idea of how the neuronal functions are affected in a person with some kind of a brain disease versus someone with a normal person and things like that. And the other thing, you can take a brain neuronal circuit and put some medicine right on top of it to see whether the figure of merit increases or it's better. So it would be a way to develop drugs for brains, basically, right? So a lot of interesting applications if you can find live neural circuits.
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
There is another thing in the chat box. In presence of other types of cell systems in their external environment, astrocytes or microglia, is this single neuronal growth? That's why this behavior was there, i.e. substrate dependent?
Oh, no. The substrate dependence was not a single neuron growth. It's actually random neuronal growth. And if not just neurons alone, fibroblasts, almost all, even we tried cancer cells, melanoma cells and all this stuff, they all have substrate preferences.
Yes.
And what is interesting is the for a given surface, certain cells love a given surface, and the certain other cells hit the same surface, So there is a really interesting field in my mind evolving where a given chemistry of surface and given type of cells, there's a like dissolve kind of thing. And so in other words, what is really happening is that the external to the cell, there are what are called extracellular matrix proteins, basically. These proteins are the ones that tell a cell what the environment is doing to it. So actually sense environment through these extracellular matrix proteins. So when I take a cell, put it on a given surface, there are certain extracellular matrix ECM proteins that would essentially decide whether this surface is a good surface or it's a bad surface. And in fact, we can do what are called genetic analysis of the cell. Look at what are the genes that the cell essentially generates. And essentially, that is the way of cell expressing whether it's unhappy or whether it's happy. And so if it's very happy, it'll express a certain type of happy what we call or if it's the unhappy, it'll express a completely different set of genes. And we found that, for example, whenever a cell likes a surface, it expresses the happy genes. And if it's on the wrong surface, it ends up emitting all the wrong genes, basically. So exactly what is the physics of why the chemistry of the surface makes such a difference? I mean, what's the difference between atrium oxide and atrium oxide? Why isn't they behave like night and day? That is still, I mean, just, but it's fascinating. It's very difficult to get the physics out because the system is relatively dirty because there's a lot of water around. You got the cells alive, you have to have nutrients, sugars, and other stuff. The figuring out physics of this is very tricky. And but on the other hand, we can see trend lines that are very interesting.
This is a happening field right now. Study of adhesion to the surfaces. Unless the cell adheres, there's not going to be any growth to surface chemistry and surface physics.
You're absolutely right. In fact, we have now developed a mathematical formula for a cell in the surface, and adhesion factor is a very, very important factor. In other words, cell is very critical. When a goes on a surface, the adhesion is good, then the cell flattens out, basically, And a really flattened out cell is really, really happy. It's sort of like in a yoga pose, I mean, really happy. Whereas if a cell is unhappy, it actually rolls up into like a ball-like thing. Right. And you can see it in a microscope. You can see on the yttrium oxide side, the fibroblast cells, they look like little balls actually curled up. Whereas on the zirconia side, they're really nice and flat, basically, because they're really adhered well. Addition to this adhesion, there's also what I call enhancement factor and also inhibition factors. There are three parameters that can actually describe this behavior. So we actually have a mathematical formula to describe the whole thing. And this varies from a cell to a surface pair, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Very nice. Okay, so I guess that was the last question we had in the chat box. So let's, unless there is some pressing question from somebody, can we? Okay, Neeraj, looks like we are happy now. So let's thank our speaker once again for a wonderful talk, Professor Venkateshan, and I'll get in touch with some of my colleagues here at Indian Science.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Venki, it has been a very nice talk. We are very thankful to you for accepting our invitation to come to join the conference for this evening talk. Just to give you this number, this talk has been listened by 620 delegates in the delegate forms. That's the number I got. So it's very interesting being online one. Now we have very large participants in this conference. Apart from that, we have also broadcasted this talk on the YouTube, the ITD channel, and I'm sure that many person must have listened to that. I take this opportunity to thank Professor Ruth Pratap also for chairing this session, and it has been very good. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Okay.
So,
Right.
Bye-bye.
bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
So,